On their honeymoon, he whispered, "Take it all off." But her attitude in that moment changed everything. What she did left him completely speechless. Where are you watching from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like because you need to find out what happened next. The warm breeze from the Atlantic swept through the open balcony doors of the presidential suite, carrying with it the sweet fragrance of beach roses that lined the gardens of the resort. White silk curtains billowed gently, like elegant ghosts dancing to the rhythm of an invisible melody. Outside, the lights of Martha's Vineyard twinkled against the black velvet of the Massachusetts sky, and the distant murmur of the ocean composed a symphony that should have been perfect. Garrison Ashford closed the suite door with a soft click that resonated like thunder in the expectant silence. His dark eyes, the color of espresso in the early morning, traveled over his wife's figure with a mixture of desire and possession that he had perfected during years of million-dollar negotiations. There was something about the way candlelight cast golden shadows across her skin that reminded him why he had chosen her. She was beautiful in a way that didn't need jewels to shine, though he had made sure to cover her with the finest money could buy. He approached her with slow, deliberate steps, each movement calculated like those of a predator who knows his prey has no escape. Wren stood by the Italian marble vanity, her reflection multiplied in the oval mirror they had specially brought from Venice for this suite. The diamonds at her ears caught the candlelight and fragmented it into 1,000 sparks that danced across the cream-colored walls. "Take it all off," he whispered when he was close enough for his breath to graze her neck. The words floated in the perfumed air, laden with expectations that Wren knew all too well. During the 3 weeks since their wedding, she had learned to recognize every tone of her husband's voice, each nuance that differentiated an order from a suggestion, a whim from a demand. This whisper belonged to the first category, and normally would have provoked in her an automatic response of submission. But something had broken inside her that night. Perhaps it had been the formal dinner at the resort's restaurant, where Garrison had introduced her to a table of international investors as my most valuable acquisition, provoking complicit laughter among men in impeccable suits and empty smiles. Perhaps it had been the way one of their wives had looked at her with a mixture of pity and recognition, as if seeing in Wren a reflection of her own past. Or perhaps it had simply been the accumulation of small humiliations, of forced silences, of smiles rehearsed before the mirror each morning. Wren raised her hands to her ears with deliberate movements, aware that Garrison's eyes followed each of her gestures. Her fingers found the clasp of the first diamond earring, a piece that cost more than everything her father had earned in 5 years of artisan work. She slid it out of her ear carefully and deposited it on the cool marble of the vanity. The sound it made touching the surface was almost imperceptible, but in the silence of the room it resonated like a declaration. The second earring followed the first, then her hands moved to her neck, where a strand of Tahitian pearls rested on her collarbone like a chain of small captive moons. She unfastened it with the same calm she had employed for the earrings and placed it beside them. The white gold bracelet was next, followed by the emerald ring he had given her as a honeymoon gift. One by one, the jewels formed a small constellation of wealth on the Venetian marble. Each piece that separated from her body seemed to take with it a layer of the person Garrison expected her to be. When she finished, Wren turned to him. Her clear eyes, the color of wild honey her grandmother used to harvest in the Vermont mountains, met his without blinking. The designer dress he had chosen for her that night remained in place, but somehow, without the jewels, it seemed like a completely different garment. Simpler, more honest. "Done," she said with a voice that didn't tremble. "Now I'm myself again." The silence that followed was so dense that Wren could hear the beats of her own heart thundering in her ears. She watched as Garrison's expression went through a fascinating metamorphosis. First confusion furrowed his brow, then something like irritation tensed his jaw. But finally, to her surprise, what remained on his face was something she had never seen in him before: vulnerability. "Why did you do that?" he asked, and his voice had lost the authoritative tone that characterized him. Wren didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked to the king-size bed with its hand-embroidered silk coverlet and sat on the edge, her bare feet finding the soft pile of the Persian rug that covered the floor. She took a moment to order her thoughts, to find the words that had been trapped in her throat for weeks. "Because I needed to remember who I am," she said finally, "and I needed you to see it too." Garrison remained motionless for several seconds, like a marble statue in one of the museums he frequented, out of social obligation. Then, slowly, as if his legs had forgotten how to move, he walked toward her and sat beside her. The bed sank slightly under his weight, and for the first time since they met, the space between them wasn't occupied by expectations or pretensions. "I don't understand," he murmured, and the admission of ignorance seemed to cost him more than any lost deal. Ren looked at him, really looked at him beyond the designer suits and the watches that cost fortunes, beyond the carefully constructed image of the real estate magnate who had conquered New York and Boston with his luxury developments. What she saw was a 43-year-old man who had forgotten how to be vulnerable, how to allow someone to see him without armor. "Then let me explain," she said, "and this time just listen. Hamis Kutumwa." Ren's memories began to flow like the Connecticut River that ran through her hometown, winding between childhood recollections and moments that had shaped her soul. She spoke of mornings in her parents' studio in Brattleboro, where the smell of wet clay mixed with the aroma of coffee her mother prepared before dawn. She described her father's calloused hands as he shaped vessels with a patience the modern world had forgotten, each piece a testament to generations of knowledge transmitted in silence. She told of Saturdays at the farmers' market, where they sold their pottery to tourists seeking souvenirs and neighbors who understood the value of handmade work. "For my family," Ren explained, "the value of things was never measured in dollars. It was measured in hours of dedication, in stories shared while we worked together, in the satisfaction of seeing something beautiful emerge from a shapeless piece of clay." Garrison listened in silence, his hands resting on his knees, fingers interlaced with a tension that contradicted the apparent calm of his face. Each word of hers seemed to strike him in a place he had kept shielded for decades. "When we met at that charity gala," Ren continued, "I saw something in you that made me believe there was more beneath the surface. The way you looked at me when I was with the children, the way you smiled when little Lucy got paint on your suit. For a moment, you weren't the Garrison Ashford from the business magazines. You were simply a man who had forgotten how to play." He remembered that night with a clarity that surprised him. The Metropolitan Museum transformed into a stage of performative generosity, where millionaires like him donated sums they wouldn't even notice in their bank accounts while posing for photographs that would demonstrate their goodness to the world. He had gone out of obligation, for the image, for the connections that were always forged at such events. But then he had seen her. Ren wasn't among the elegant guests holding champagne flutes with jeweled fingers. She was in a corner of the museum, kneeling on plastic that protected the floor, surrounded by children from a local shelter participating in an art workshop. Her simple dress was stained with tempera paint, her chestnut hair escaped from an improvised bun, and her laughter was so genuine that it cut through the pretentious murmur of the gala like a ray of sunlight on a cloudy day. That night, Garrison admitted in a hoarse voice, was the first time in years I felt something real. Ren nodded, her eyes bright with the candlelight reflected in them. "I know, I saw it in your face when you approached. But Garrison, since we got married, that man has been disappearing. He's been replaced by someone who covers me with jewels as if they were bandages for wounds I don't have, who displays me at dinners like a newly polished trophy, who expects me to be," her voice broke slightly, "who expects me to be someone else." The words fell on him like stones in a still pond, creating ripples that disturbed waters that had remained stagnant too long. He wanted to defend himself, explain that the jewels were gifts of love, that the dinners were opportunities for her to shine, that everything he did was to give her the life she deserved. But the justifications died on his lips when he saw the expression on his wife's face. It wasn't anger that was there. It was something worse. It was sadness. "These last few days at Martha's Vineyard," Ren continued, "I've felt lonelier than in my entire life. And that's ironic, don't you think? Being in the most luxurious place I've ever set foot, surrounded by everything money can buy and feeling completely empty." Garrison rose from the bed with an abrupt movement, walking to the open balcony where the Atlantic breeze continued bringing promises of beach roses in bloom. His reflection in the glass returned the image of a man he didn't recognize. Tense shoulders, clenched jaw, eyes darkened by emotions he had spent years learning to suppress. "What do you want me to do?" he asked without turning, and the question contained more desperation than he intended to show. Wren stood and walked to him, stopping at his side before the balcony. The view of Martha's vineyard stretched before them like a tapestry of lights and shadows, but neither was really looking at it. "I want you to remember who you were before all this," she answered softly. "I want to know the young architect from Pittsburgh who drew dreams on bar napkins. I want you to look at me, not as a possession you've acquired, but as a companion with whom to share a life, and I want—" She hesitated a moment before continuing. "I want to be able to be myself at your side, without feeling that I disappoint you by not being brilliant enough, elegant enough, sufficiently yours." The last words hung suspended between them, fragile as soap bubbles about to burst. Garrison finally turned to her, and in the dim light of the room, his eyes shone with something wet that he would have fiercely denied if anyone had pointed it out. "I don't know if that man still exists," he confessed, and the honesty of the admission left him exposed in a way he hadn't experienced since his father's death 20 years ago. "I don't know if I can be what you need." Wren raised a hand and placed it on his cheek, a gesture so simple and so intimate that Garrison felt the ground move beneath his feet. "I'm not asking you to be perfect," she said. "I'm just asking you to try, to let me help you find what you've lost, to start over, this time without pretensions, without impossible expectations, without jewels that weigh more than our words." The silence that followed was different from the previous one. It was no longer dense with unresolved tension, but soft with newly discovered possibilities. Outside, the ocean continued whispering secrets to the shore, and the beach roses continued perfuming the air, indifferent to the human drama unfolding in that luxury suite. Garrison covered her hand with his, noticing for the first time how small it was, how warm, how real. "Where do we start?" he asked, and the vulnerability in his voice was a gift he didn't know he could give. Wren smiled, a smile that hadn't appeared on her face since before the wedding, since those days when he courted her with genuine awkwardness instead of grandiose gestures. "We start tomorrow morning," she answered, "and we start with a walk on the beach. No jewels. No reservations at Michelin-starred restaurants. Just you and me, barefoot on the sand, trying to remember why we decided to walk together in the first place." That night, for the first time since the honeymoon began, they slept embracing without expectations, without pretensions, with nothing between them except the fragile promise of a new beginning. Dawn over Martha's vineyard painted the sky with shades of pink and gold that not even the most talented artist could capture. Garrison woke before Wren, something unusual for a man accustomed to being awakened by room service with freshly brewed coffee and perfectly folded financial newspapers. He remained motionless for several minutes, watching his wife's sleeping face. Without makeup, with her chestnut hair spread across the white pillow like a silk fan, she seemed younger, more serene, more herself. The words from the previous night echoed in his mind like an echo that refused to fade. "I want to know the young architect from Pittsburgh who drew dreams on bar napkins. Did that young man still exist somewhere inside him?" Garrison had spent 15 years building an empire, each brick placed on the rubble of his youthful ideals. The 28-year-old Garrison, who had arrived in New York with a suitcase full of blueprints and a head full of visions, had believed that architecture was an art, that buildings could transform communities, that success was measured in improved lives, not financial statements. When had he stopped believing that? Wren moved slightly, her eyelids trembling with the last vestiges of some dream. When she finally opened her eyes and found him watching her, a shy smile curved her lips. "Good morning," she murmured, her voice husky with sleep. "Good morning," he responded, and something in the simplicity of the exchange seemed more valuable than any million-dollar negotiation he had closed. Half an hour later, they walked along the resort beach, their bare feet leaving temporary marks in the wet sand that the waves would erase within minutes. Wren had insisted on leaving behind not only the jewels, but also the cell phones, the smartwatches, any connection to the world that expected something from them. "Tell me about Pittsburgh," she asked as they walked, the warm Atlantic water lapping at their ankles. Garrison kept silent for a moment, searching for memories he had buried under layers of board meetings and real estate contracts. When he finally spoke, his voice had a different quality, softer, less controlled. It was a city in transformation when I grew up there. The old industrial Pittsburgh was disappearing, giving way to something new. My father was a steel worker at a mill that closed when I was 14. I remember seeing him come home that day, still holding his yellow hard hat, the lost look of someone who had lost more than a job. Wren listened in silence, aware that she was witnessing something rare, Garrison Ashford lowering his defenses. That night I promised him I would never be in that position, he continued, that I would build something no one could take from me. I studied architecture because I loved the idea of creating spaces where people could live their lives. But at some point, he stopped, looking toward the horizon where the sun continued rising. At some point, I stopped designing homes and started building investments. And what happened to the love? Wren asked. The love for creating? The question hit him harder than she probably intended. Garrison picked up a shell from the ground, examining it with an attention he hadn't devoted to something so simple in years. I suppose I traded it for security, he admitted. Each successful project was one more wall between my family and the poverty I had experienced as a child. But I built so many walls that I ended up locking myself inside my own fortress. They stopped at a small rocky promontory that jutted into the sea. Waves broke against the stones with a gentle violence, white foam exploding in 1,000 directions before retreating to try again. My father died 20 years ago, Garrison said, the words coming out of him as if they had a will of their own. He never got to see my first completed project. Sometimes I wonder if he would be proud of what I've become, or if he would look at me with the same disappointment he looked at himself when he lost his job. Wren took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. The shell he had picked up was trapped between their palms, a small shared treasure. My father always says that a father's pride isn't in what his children achieve, but in the people they choose to be, she said. And I think the fact that you're here barefoot on the sand, telling me this instead of checking emails on your phone, says a lot about the person you're choosing to be today. Garrison looked at her, really looked at her, as if he were seeing her for the first time. And perhaps he was. Perhaps during the months of courtship, during the wedding planning, during the weeks of marriage, he had been so busy seeing her as he wanted her to be that he had never stopped to see who she really was. Tell me about your family, he asked. Tell me about Brattleboro, the studio, the pottery. I want to understand where you come from. Wren's face lit up with a joy that the most expensive jewels had never managed to provoke. My parents' house smells like wet clay and strong coffee, she began, and as she spoke her hands gestured with an animation Garrison hadn't seen since the charity gala. The studio is on the ground floor right below the kitchen, so when my mother cooks, the vibrations from my father's wheel make the pots tremble. It's a beautiful mess. Pottery drying on every available surface, design sketches pinned to the walls with rusty thumbtacks, the neighbor's cat that always finds a way in and leaves paw prints on the unfired pieces. Garrison listened, fascinated, as she painted with words a world that couldn't be farther from his glass and steel offices in downtown Manhattan. It was a world of accepted imperfections, of beauty found in the ordinary, of value measured in human connections instead of financial transactions. My parents were never rich, Wren continued. There were difficult years, months when we didn't know how we'd pay the bills, but never, not once, did I see them treat each other with less than absolute respect and affection. Every morning my father makes my mother's coffee exactly how she likes it, with 2 spoons of sugar and a dash of cinnamon. And every night, no matter how tired they are, they have dinner together at the small kitchen table, talking about the day, about orders, about us, the children. Do you have siblings? Garrison asked, realizing with shame that it was the first time he'd asked that question. A younger sister, Hazel. She's an art teacher at an elementary school in Burlington, and an older brother, Caleb, who inherited our father's talent and now runs the studio while they gradually retire. They had walked without realizing it to a beachside shack that was just opening for the day. A middle-aged man with skin weathered by decades of New England sun dragged plastic tables onto the sand, while a woman with a generous smile lit the griddle where soon fish would sizzle. "Are you hungry?" Garrison asked, pointing to the humble establishment. Wren looked at him with a mixture of surprise and hope. "You want to have breakfast here, instead of the resort restaurant?" He shrugged, a gesture so uncharacteristic it almost made her laugh. "You said to start over. I guess that includes trying new things." They sat at one of the white plastic tables, their feet still covered with sand, the sun warming their backs. The owner of the shack brought them coffee in thick glass mugs and recommended the blueberry pancakes with local maple syrup, a breakfast so simple that Garrison would normally have dismissed it without thinking. But that morning, sitting across from his wife at that nameless shack, with the sound of waves as background music and the taste of maple syrup dancing on his tongue, Garrison felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. The last days of the honeymoon passed in a bubble of rediscovery. Garrison and Wren explored coastal villages, ate at hidden restaurants where owners told them stories of their grandparents, walked trails that didn't appear in any tourist guide. He learned to leave his phone in the room. She learned to see beyond the image he projected. But bubbles, however beautiful, always end up bursting. The return to New York was like diving into ice water after weeks in warm waters. JFK Airport received them with its efficient bustle, and Garrison's driver waited with a black Mercedes so shiny it seemed to absorb the New York sunlight instead of reflecting it. The penthouse apartment in Tribeca was exactly as Wren remembered, beautiful, imposing, and completely devoid of warmth. The high ceilings with original 19th-century moldings contrasted with the minimalist furniture that a famous decorator had chosen without asking anyone's preferences. The view of Manhattan was spectacular, but the windows remained closed most of the time, sealing the interior from the outside world. "I've reorganized your schedule for the next 2 weeks," announced Marcus, Garrison's personal assistant, before they could even put down their luggage. "There are 3 urgent business dinners, a meeting with the investors for the Boston project, and the board has requested a presentation on next quarter's projections." Wren watched as the relaxed expression Garrison had cultivated during the last few days faded, replaced by the professional mask she knew all too well. It was like watching a flower close at nightfall, its petals retracting to protect a vulnerable center. "Also," Marcus continued, consulting his tablet with mechanical efficiency, "Mrs. Fernsby Whitmore has called 3 times to confirm your attendance at Saturday's charity gala. She says she's reserved a table next to the Vandermeer Hollingsworth and expects Mrs. Ashford to wear something appropriate for the occasion." The words "something appropriate" fell on Wren like a bucket of cold water. During the weeks at Martha's Vineyard, she had managed to temporarily forget the expectations that came with her new surname. But here, in this apartment where every object seemed to judge her for not being refined enough, reality hit her with renewed force. The following days were an exercise in silent survival. Garrison was absorbed by meetings that started early and ended late, returning home with increasingly pronounced dark circles and an irritability he could barely contain. The intimate conversations they had shared on the beach seemed to belong to another life, to other people who perhaps had never really existed. "You need a new dress for Saturday," he said one evening. Without looking up from the documents he was reviewing in his study, "I've spoken with the boutique on Madison Avenue. They're expecting you tomorrow at 10. Wren, who had been reading on the nearby sofa waiting for him to finish so they could have dinner together, felt something tighten in her chest. "I have dresses," she responded, trying to keep her voice neutral. "I don't need a new one." "Yours aren't appropriate for this type of event," Garrison replied, and although his tone wasn't cruel, each word cut like small shards of glass. "This year's gala is especially important. There will be several politicians, ambassadors. I need you to make a good impression." "I need you to make a good impression." Not "I want you to feel comfortable," or "I'd like you to shine." Need. As if she were just another tool in his business arsenal, an accessory that had to fulfill a specific function. "Garrison," she said, closing her book with deliberate slowness, "do you remember what we talked about at Martha's Vineyard? About starting over, about stopping treating me like a possession?" He finally looked up, and in his eyes she could see a battle between the man who had begun to emerge on the beach and the magnate that the business world demanded he be. "This is different," he said, rubbing his eyes with fatigue. We're not in a vacation bubble. This is the real world with real consequences. I can't afford to have—" He stopped, aware that he was about to cross a line. "To have what?" Ren pressed, standing up. "To have your wife embarrass you? To have someone notice that I don't belong in your social circle? Don't put words in my mouth." "Then tell me what the right words are, because since we got back to New York, I feel like I'm losing the man I met on the beach." The silence that followed was laden with unresolved tensions, half-kept promises, conflicting expectations. Outside, the lights of New York shone with indifference, oblivious to the drama unfolding in that luxury penthouse. Garrison rose from his desk and walked toward her, stopping one step away. For a moment, Ren thought he was going to apologize, remember the conversations they'd had, choose to be the man she had glimpsed on the coast. But instead, he said, "The world doesn't stop because we're having an existential crisis, Ren. I have responsibilities, employees who depend on me, projects that require my attention. I can't afford to be soft." "I didn't ask you to be soft," she responded, and her voice trembled despite her efforts to keep it steady. "I asked you to be authentic, to see me as your partner, not as another problem to solve." "I'm trying." "Really? Because since we landed, we haven't had a single conversation that doesn't involve your schedule, your business, or what you need me to do to fit into your world." The words floated between them, heavy with unwanted truth. Garrison opened his mouth to respond, but his phone chose that moment to vibrate with an urgent notification. He looked at the screen by reflex, and that simple action, that small involuntary betrayal, said more than any words. "I have to answer this," he murmured, already moving away toward his study. Ren watched him go, feeling something break silently inside her. It wasn't the dramatic crack of a heart shattering, but the subtler creak of hope beginning to crumble. That night, she slept in the guest room for the first time since they'd married. The mattress was equally expensive as the one in the master bedroom, the sheets equally soft, but it felt like a different continent. And in the darkness of the luxury apartment, while the lights of Manhattan twinkled through the curtains, Ren began to wonder if the man she had met on the beach had been real, or simply another illusion in a life full of mirages. 3 months after the honeymoon, Ren made a decision that would change the course of everything. It was an October morning, when New York was beginning to dress in the ochre colors of autumn. Garrison had left before dawn for a meeting with international investors, leaving only a note on the pillow that said, "Back late, don't wait up." The notes had become their main form of communication. Small papers that substituted for conversations neither seemed to have energy to maintain. Ren made her coffee in the immaculate kitchen of the apartment, a kitchen designed more to be photographed than used, with marble countertops that had never seen a stain and appliances that looked like modern art. She carried the cup to the living room window and watched the city wake beneath her. Millions of people beginning their routines, oblivious to the woman watching them from above, feeling like she was floating in a gilded limbo. Her phone vibrated with a message from her brother Caleb. "Mom's asking when you're coming. The wheel Grandma gave you is still waiting for you in the studio. We miss you. Sis." The words, simple and laden with unconditional love, were the drop that overflowed a glass that had been filling for weeks. Ren began to cry, silent tears that rolled down her cheeks and fell onto the hardwood floor, small drops of salt that would be lost without a trace when the cleaning service arrived later. But as she cried, something else began to grow inside her, a determination that had been dormant, buried under layers of failed attempts to adapt, to fit in, to be the wife Garrison seemed to need. That afternoon, while Garrison remained trapped in his world of numbers and negotiations, Ren took the subway to Williamsburg. She walked through narrow streets where New York's history mixed with contemporary street art, where small family businesses resisted gentrification with admirable stubbornness, where people of dozens of nationalities coexisted in a cacophony of languages and cultures. And there, on a side street descending toward the East River, she found what she didn't know she was looking for, an empty space with a faded "For Rent" sign in the window. The space was small, perhaps 600 square feet, with walls stained with dampness and a floor of hydraulic tiles that had once been beautiful. Light entered through a large window facing the street, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stale air. It was, by all the standards Garrison would have used, a disaster, but Wren could see beyond the imperfections. She saw shelves filled with pottery drying in the afternoon sun. She saw a potter's wheel in the corner by the window, spinning while clay-stained hands shaped beauty from nothing. She saw work tables, where students of all ages would learn ancestral techniques that risked being lost in a world obsessed with the fast and disposable. She saw a place where she could be herself again. She called the number on the sign without thinking twice. That night, when Garrison finally came home past 11, he found his wife waiting for him in the living room. She wasn't reading or watching TV or doing any of the passive activities with which she usually filled the hours of his absence. She was simply sitting on the sofa, hands clasped in her lap, an expression of calm determination on her face that he hadn't seen before. "We need to talk," she said before he could put down his briefcase. Garrison frowned, alarm evident in his eyes. In his experience, "we need to talk" never preceded good news. "What happened? Are you okay?" "I'm perfectly fine," Wren responded. "In fact, I think today I made the first decision that's made me feel alive since we got back from the honeymoon." He sat across from her, loosening his tie with an automatic gesture he repeated every night. "What are you talking about?" "I found a space in Williamsburg. I'm going to open a traditional pottery studio." The silence that followed was different from the tense silences that had dominated their relationship in recent weeks. This was the silence of genuine surprise, of someone who hadn't seen the blow coming. "A pottery studio?" Garrison repeated, as if the words didn't make sense together. "Yes, I'll teach the techniques I learned from my family, the same ones that have been passed down generation after generation in Vermont. Traditional American pottery, hand-painted, made with patience and love instead of machines and rush." Garrison blinked several times, processing the information. "But you don't need to work. You have access to everything you could need. If you want a hobby, I can." "It's not a hobby," Wren interrupted, and there was steel in her voice. "It's my vocation, it's what I am, and I need to return to it before I lose myself completely." "Wren, think about what you're saying. My wife working in a clay studio in Williamsburg? Do you know what people will say?" "I don't care what they say. But I do care," he exploded, standing up. "I have an image to maintain, a reputation that—" "Your reputation," she repeated, and now she too stood facing him with all the height of her 5'5" frame. "Always your reputation. And what about my well-being, my happiness, the promises you made to me at Martha's Vineyard about starting over?" That was different. We were on vacation. The real world didn't apply. The real world is exactly where we need to apply what we learned. It doesn't make sense to be authentic, only when no one's watching. Garrison began pacing back and forth across the living room, his figure reflected in the windows like a ghost trapped between two dimensions. "I can't support this," he said finally, stopping before her. "I can't allow my wife to become... What? A worker? Someone who does something useful with her time instead of attending empty lunches and unbearable galas. Don't put words in my mouth. Then say yours. Tell me exactly why the honest work of my parents, the work that formed me as a person, is something I should be ashamed of." The question hung between them, a challenge that Garrison didn't know how to answer, because deep down, very deep in his being, he knew there was no answer that would make him look good. "You're not asking my permission, are you?" he said after a long silence. "No," Wren confirmed. "I'm informing you. And I'm giving you the opportunity to choose how you want to react. You can support me, you can ignore me, or you can try to stop me. But whatever your choice, tomorrow I'm signing the rental contract." Garrison looked at her, and in his eyes she could see a storm of conflicting emotions, anger, fear, wounded pride, but also, deep down, something that might have been admiration. "You're the most stubborn person I've ever met," he said finally. "I learned from the best," she responded. "My grandmother used to say that the most resistant clay is the one worked with the most patience. Maybe you and I just need more time on the wheel." He didn't respond, but something in the tension of his shoulders relaxed imperceptibly. It wasn't acceptance yet, but it also wasn't the total resistance she had feared. That night, they slept in the same bed for the first time in weeks. There was no intimacy or deep conversations, but when Ren woke at some point in the early morning, she felt his arm over her waist, an unconscious gesture that spoke of a bond that, though battered, hadn't completely broken. On the day of the studio's opening, 3 weeks after signing the contract, Ren rose before dawn. The nervousness she felt was different from what she experienced before Garrison's social events. This was a nervousness loaded with hope, with genuine anticipation, with the excitement of someone about to present an essential part of themselves to the world. The Williamsburg space had been transformed with more manual labor than money. Ren had spent days sanding the walls with her own hands, painting them a creamy white that made the natural light from the window bounce throughout the space. The hydraulic floor tiles, once dirty and opaque, now gleamed after hours of patient cleaning that revealed their original geometric patterns. Reclaimed wood shelves, built with the help of her brother Caleb during a weekend visit, occupied the walls, ready to display the first creations. In the center of the space, like an altar to everything she loved, rested the potter's wheel her grandmother had given her years ago. It was an antique piece, of wood worn by generations of use, but it functioned with the same silent precision as always. Ren had cried when she saw it installed in its new home, tears of gratitude for a woman who was no longer there, but whose wisdom continued guiding her hands. Garrison hadn't helped with the studio preparation, nor had he actively obstructed, which was, Ren supposed, a form of truce. He came home every night to find her exhausted but radiant, with paint stains on her hands and plaster dust in her hair, talking enthusiastically about the day's progress. He listened in silence, his expression inscrutable, offering neither support nor criticism. On opening day, however, something changed. Ren was finishing placing the last decorative pieces when the studio door opened and her mother entered. Eleanor Hartley, a 62-year-old woman with hands eternally stained with ceramic glaze and a smile that could light up dark rooms, ran to her daughter with open arms. "My girl," she murmured while hugging her, "I'm so proud of you." Behind her came her father, Thomas, her brother Caleb with his wife and children, her sister Hazel, who had taken a train from Burlington, and a dozen more people from Brattleboro who had traveled to witness this moment. The studio filled with laughter, with overlapping conversations, with hugs that lasted longer than was socially acceptable in Garrison circles. The aroma of coffee that Eleanor had brought in huge thermoses mixed with the persistent smell of new clay, creating a fragrance that for Ren smelled like home. And then, when she least expected it, the door opened once more. Garrison entered wearing a suit that cost more than the monthly rent of the space, but there was something different in his posture, something less rigid, less controlled. He carried in his hands a package wrapped clumsily that he had clearly tried to decorate himself, with paper wrinkled at the corners and a bow hanging unevenly. Silence fell over the studio like a heavy blanket. Ren's family knew him only from wedding photos and the cautious comments she had made during phone calls. The real estate magnate, whose image appeared regularly in business magazines, seemed completely out of place among these people with working hands and sincere smiles. "I hope I'm not late," Garrison said, and his voice contained a vulnerability that surprised even Ren. She walked toward him, aware of all the eyes following them. "You came, man," was all she could say. "I couldn't miss the most important day of your life," he responded, extending the package toward her. "This is for you. I chose it myself, without help from Marcus or any personal assistant." Ren unwrapped the gift with trembling hands, the wrinkled paper falling to the tiled floor like improvised confetti. Inside was an artisan leather apron, the kind professional potters use, with her name hand-embroidered on the front pocket, Ren Hartley Ashford, artisan. The use of her maiden name first, followed by her married name, didn't go unnoticed. It was a small gesture, but it said a lot. She was first herself and then part of him. "Thank you," she whispered, and the tears that had been threatening all morning finally escaped. Eleanor, with the intuition of mothers who can read emotional situations better than any book, approached Garrison with open arms. "So you're the man who won my daughter's heart," she said, while hugging him with a familiarity that clearly made him uncomfortable. "We hope to see you more often, son-in-law, and maybe next time, without the suit. Here we get our hands dirty." Something in Garrison's face softened. Perhaps it was the genuine warmth of the embrace, or the total absence of pretension in these people, or simply the studio atmosphere that seemed to dissolve the most elaborate armor. For the first time since he'd arrived, his posture relaxed. "Maybe I could," he began, looking at Ren. "Maybe I could stop by here sometime to learn, if I wouldn't be in the way." The smile that lit up his wife's face was answer enough. The first weeks of the studio were a whirlwind of discovery. Ren began with small classes, 4 or 5 students per session, mostly women of different ages and backgrounds, seeking something that modern life didn't give them: time to create, to concentrate, to make something with their own hands they could touch, feel, admire. Among the first students was a banking executive suffering from chronic anxiety, a grandmother who wanted to connect with memories of her childhood on a farm in Pennsylvania, a teenager who felt invisible in the world of social media, and a Venezuelan immigrant who found in clay a bridge between her lost home and her new life. The studio transformed into more than a place of learning. It became a refuge, a space where people could remove the masks the world required them to wear and simply be. The conversations that flowed while hands worked the clay were as valuable as the techniques taught. Stories of love and loss, of abandoned dreams and renewed hopes, curved small daily victories that would never appear in any newspaper. And one November afternoon, when the autumn sun tinged Williamsburg streets with golden tones, Garrison appeared at the studio door without his usual suit. He wore khakis and an old shirt Ren didn't recognize, and on his face was an expression of nervous determination. "I think it's time I learn to work with my hands," he said, "if you're still willing to teach me." Ren guided him to her grandmother's wheel, tied the leather apron that had been his gift, and for the first time since they'd met, she taught him something that had nothing to do with galas, business, or social expectations. She taught him to create. The following months were a period of precarious balance. Garrison divided his time between his business empire and increasingly frequent visits to the studio, slowly learning that clay didn't respond to orders or demands, that it required patience and sensitivity, 2 qualities the business world didn't reward. His first creations were glorious disasters that Ren lovingly kept on a special shelf: asymmetrical bowls, vessels that collapsed on themselves, mugs with handles that came off at first use. But with each failure, something in him softened. The need for perfection that had dominated his life began to yield to the acceptance that mistakes were part of the process, that beauty often emerged from the unexpected. One night, while they were cleaning the studio after a particularly intense class, Garrison made a confession Ren didn't expect. "I've been thinking about scaling back my projects," he said, his hands still stained with gray clay. "There are too many that I only do for the money, for status, projects that destroy more than they build." Ren stopped sweeping and looked at him, searching his eyes for signs that he was serious. "What made you think about that?" He sat on one of the studio stools, fatigue visible in every line of his face. "Today I had a meeting about the Boston project. You know, the luxury complex we're building near the historic district. One of the neighborhood residents came to the meeting, an older man, probably your father's age. He told me he'd lived there his whole life, that his father was born in that same house, that there are memories in those walls that no check could compensate for." "And what did you tell him?" "I said what I always say, that progress is inevitable, that the economic compensation is generous, that the new building will bring life to the neighborhood." Garrison rubbed his eyes with his stained hands, leaving traces of clay on his forehead. "But while I was speaking, I realized I didn't even believe my own words. I heard myself and felt ashamed." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but contemplative. Outside, Williamsburg's nightlife was beginning to wake. Music from different parts of the world, laughter in various languages, the smell of foods representing a culinary map of the planet. "Do you remember why you became an architect?" Ren asked softly. Garrison looked up at her, and in his eyes was something that seemed like the echo of a younger man, one who still believed buildings could change lives. "I wanted to build homes," he said. "Not properties, not investments. but homes. Places where people could raise their children, where families could share meals, where memories would accumulate like layers of paint on loving walls. And when did you stop building homes? The question was simple, but it contained years of accumulated decisions, of compromises with ambition, of sacrifices made at the altar of success. When the first project became the second, and the second became the 10th, and suddenly I no longer saw faces, only numbers. Square footage, profit margins, return on investment. His voice broke slightly. At some point, I stopped being an architect and became a speculator with construction knowledge. Wren approached him and took his stained hands between hers, equally covered with dry clay. "It's never too late to start over," she said. "Look at this studio. 6 months ago, it was an abandoned space. Now it's a place where people find peace, where they create, where they connect with something bigger than themselves. If a space can transform like that, imagine what a person can do." But transformation wasn't simple or linear. The following weeks brought resistance from all fronts. Garrison's partners questioned his decisions, insinuating that his artisan wife's influence was affecting his business judgment. Society magazines began publishing veiled critical articles about the Ashfords' eccentricity, with photos of Wren in the studio alongside condescending comments about millionaires playing at being craftspeople. And then came the dinner that changed everything. It was December, and New York's business world was celebrating its last meetings of the year with the usual ostentation. Garrison had been invited to a private dinner at 11 Madison Park, where the main actors of a potentially lucrative deal would gather, the construction of a mega tourist complex on the North Carolina coast. "You don't have to come if you don't want to," he had told Wren while getting dressed that night. "I'm going with you," she had responded, aware that her presence would be an act of silent resistance. The restaurant was everything she expected and feared, an explosion of culinary creativity that turned food into spectacle, a temple to excess, where each dish cost more than many families spent on a week of groceries. The other guests looked at her with the familiar mixture of curiosity and disdain she had learned to recognize in Garrison's circles. The dinner progressed with conversations about financial returns and political connections when Heinrich Braun, the German investor leading the project, turned to Wren with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "So you're the famous wife who turned our Garrison into a, how do you Americans say, a softie?" His English was correct, but laden with an accent that made each word sound like a small aggression. "I heard he now spends more time playing with clay than closing deals." Silence fell over the table. All eyes turned to Garrison, waiting for him to correct his wife, put her in her place, demonstrate that he was still the ruthless magnate they knew and wanted to do business with. But Garrison, to everyone's surprise, including his own, did something different. "What my wife does isn't playing, Mr. Braun," he said, his voice firm but without the aggressiveness he normally employed in such situations. "It's an art that has more cultural value than any tourist complex we might build together. And as for being a softie," he paused, looking at Wren with a tenderness he had never shown in public, "perhaps you're right. Perhaps I have become softer. And that doesn't make me a worse businessman, it makes me a better person." Heinrich Braun laughed, a short, derisive laugh. Pretty words for a businessman, but pretty words don't build buildings or generate profits. "If this is the kind of person you've become, perhaps we should reconsider our partnership." "Perhaps you should," Garrison responded, and there was something in his voice that made the other investors shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Because the project you're proposing will destroy a protected coastal area, displace fishing communities that have lived there for generations, and turn another piece of America into a theme park for millionaires who want to pretend they're in some tropical paradise, and I no longer want to be part of that." The silence that followed was absolute. Garrison stood, extended a hand to Wren, and together they walked toward the restaurant exit, leaving behind half-drunk wine glasses, crumpled linen napkins, and the astonished faces of people who couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Outside, the cold December air hit them like a revitalizing embrace. Wren looked at her husband, searching for signs of regret or panic about what he had just done. But what she found was something she didn't expect. Garrison was smiling. "I just lost a $50 million deal," he said, and the smile widened. "Why the hell do I feel like I gained something much more valuable?" Wren took his arm as they walked through New York streets, the Christmas lights twinkling above them like witnesses to a moment neither would forget. "Because you did," she answered. "You chose to be the man you always wanted to be instead of the man the world expected you to be." That night, while New York slept under a blanket of Christmas expectations, something fundamental changed in the dynamics of their marriage. It wasn't a dramatic or instant change, but the kind of silent transformation that occurs when two people decide together that authenticity is worth more than the world's approval. The new year arrived with consequences Garrison had anticipated, but hadn't imagined clearly. The scene at 11 Madison Park had become legend in New York and Boston business circles, and interpretations varied depending on who told the story. For some, Garrison Ashford had gone insane, seduced by an opportunist from the provinces who was systematically destroying him. For others, he had shown an integrity the business world rarely saw, though that integrity was commercially suicidal. What no one denied was that something had changed irreversibly. Projects began to vanish one after another. Investors who had once competed to partner with him now avoided his calls. Meetings that had been confirmed were cancelled with transparent excuses. Marcus's phone, his assistant's, which used to never stop ringing, now spent hours in silence. One February morning, Garrison found himself alone in his downtown Manhattan office, a space of glass and steel he had designed to intimidate, to project power and success. But in the solitude of those four transparent walls, power seemed to have evaporated like morning mist. He reviewed the financial reports with a growing sense of vertigo. The accounts remained impressive by any normal standard, but compared to what they had been a year ago, they showed a downward trend he couldn't ignore. Cancelled projects, lost clients, opportunities that evaporated before materializing. For the first time in 15 years, Garrison Ashford faced the real possibility of failure. That night, instead of returning to the Tribeca apartment, he drove aimlessly through New York streets. His hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, a physical symptom of the emotional earthquake shaking him. He ended up parking in front of a neighborhood bar in the Lower East Side, an unpretentious establishment where no one would recognize him, where he could drink cheap whiskey without anyone photographing his fall. But even in that improvised refuge, he couldn't escape his thoughts. With each drink, the critical voices grew louder. "What have you done? Why did you ruin everything for a woman who doesn't even belong in your world? What would your father say seeing you fail?" The last question hit him with particular force. His father, dead for 2 decades, continued to be the invisible judge of all his actions. He had built his empire to prove to him that he could triumph where he had failed, and now he was watching that empire crumble. He arrived home past midnight, staggering slightly. Wren was waiting for him in the living room, her face marked with worry. "I tried to call you," she said, approaching him. "Marcus said you left the office early, but he didn't know where." "Does it matter where I went?" He responded with a bitterness that surprised even himself. "Does anything I do matter anymore?" Wren took a step back, hurt by the tone, but trying to stay calm. "Garrison, what happened?" "What happened is my company is sinking," he exploded, and all the rage, fear, frustration of accumulated weeks poured out in an avalanche of words. "My partners are abandoning me. My investors are fleeing like rats from a ship, and all because I decided to follow. Because I decided." He stopped, unable to complete the sentence, but the silence was more eloquent than any words. "Because I decided to follow you." Wren understood what wasn't said. She read it in his eyes, in the tension of his shoulders, in the way he avoided looking at her directly. "Do you blame me?" she asked, and her voice was barely a whisper. "No, I don't know. It's not that simple." Garrison let himself fall onto the sofa, his head in his hands. "I know the decision was mine. I know no one forced me to do what I did at that dinner, but if you hadn't married me, none of this would have happened." The silence that followed was the confirmation Wren didn't want to hear. She stood from the sofa where she'd sat beside him and walked to the window, turning her back to him, hiding the tears beginning to form. "Maybe you're right," she said finally. "Maybe I was selfish to think we could have everything. Your world and mine, your success and my authenticity, your money and my values. Wren, I didn't mean, but you thought it," she interrupted, turning to him. "And maybe you've thought other things too. Maybe you wonder if you married the wrong person. Hey, if everything would have been easier with someone from your circle, someone who wouldn't have challenged you to change." Garrison looked at her, and in the dim light of the apartment, her eyes shone with contained tears she refused to shed. "I don't know what I think," he admitted, and the honesty of the confession was almost more painful than a lie. "I'm lost, Ren. I don't know who I am if I'm not the successful businessman. I don't know what value I have if I can't measure my success in numbers." "That's exactly the problem," she responded, and now her voice trembled with a mixture of sadness and frustration. "You're still measuring your value with the wrong ruler. What you did at that dinner, what you've been trying to do these months, doesn't make you less valuable. It makes you more human. But if after everything we've talked about, everything we've shared, you still believe your value depends on your bank account, then maybe we haven't moved forward as much as I thought." That night, for the second time in their marriage, they slept in separate rooms, but unlike the first time, when it was Ren who went to the guest room, this time it was Garrison who couldn't face the proximity of the woman he had hurt with his doubts. In the darkness of his self-imposed solitude, while Manhattan lights twinkled indifferently beyond the window, Garrison confronted the emptiness he had tried to fill for 15 years with financial success. And for the first time, he allowed himself to admit that this emptiness wasn't shaped like a bank account or a business magazine cover. It was shaped like fear, fear of being insignificant, fear of disappointing a father who could no longer be disappointed, fear of discovering that without his millionaire armor, there was nothing underneath. The following weeks were the darkest Garrison had experienced since his father's death. Physically, he continued functioning, went to the office, answered calls, reviewed documents. But it was like watching himself from outside, an automaton executing movements that had lost all meaning. Ren, for her part, found refuge in the studio. The hours she spent before the wheel, feeling the wet clay spin under her hands, were the only ones when she managed to quiet the storm of her thoughts. Her students noticed something had changed. Spontaneous laughter was less frequent. Coffee breaks had diminished. The sparkle in her eyes had dimmed. "Do you want to talk about it?" asked Carmen, the banking executive who had become a close friend, one March afternoon while they cleaned the studio after class. Ren sighed, hanging the stained aprons on their corresponding hooks. "I don't know if there's anything to talk about. Garrison and we're in the same apartment but living on different planets. We pass each other in the mornings, exchange polite phrases, but the man I married seems to have disappeared." "Have you thought about leaving him?" Ren completed, and the word hung between them like a threat. "Every day. And every day I tell myself that real love doesn't give up at the first storm. But this isn't a storm, Carmen. It's a winter that seems to have no end." That night, when Ren returned to the Tribeca apartment, she found something unexpected. The lights were on in Garrison's study, but instead of the usual sounds of keys and phone calls, there was silence. She pushed the half-open door and found him sitting on the floor, surrounded by boxes she'd never seen. Old photographs scattered around him, yellowed documents, objects that seemed rescued from another era. "What's all this?" she asked from the threshold. Garrison looked up, and she could see he had been crying. The tears had left shiny trails on his cheeks, and his eyes were reddened in a way that made him seem more human than she'd seen him in months. "My father's things," he answered in a hoarse voice. "I stored them in a warehouse when he died and never opened them. 20 years avoiding looking at what was inside these boxes." Ren approached slowly, sitting on the floor across from him, careful not to step on the scattered photos. "Why now?" He picked up one of the photos, a young man in a worker's hard hat, smiling at the camera with evident pride, arms crossed over his chest in a pose radiating confidence. "Because I needed to remember who he really was, not the version I built in my head." He passed the photo to Ren. "This was my father before he lost his job." Before defeat broke him. Look at that smile, look at his eyes. Ren observed the image, seeing in it the man Garrison had tried to avenge throughout his adult life. "He looks like you," she said softly. "Not physically, but the energy, the fire in his eyes." "That fire went out when the mill closed," Garrison said, and his voice broke. I watched my father wither day after day, becoming a shadow of who he'd been. And I swore I would never let that happen to me, that I would build something so big, so solid, that nothing and no one could take it from me. But the price. The price was becoming someone he wouldn't have recognized. Garrison picked up another photo, this one showing his father with a small child in his arms, himself, at 5 or 6 years old. You know what he used to tell me when I was little? That the most important thing in life wasn't money or power, but having someone who looks at you like you're the sun. My mother looked at him that way, and he told me that someday I would find someone who looked at me that way. Tears now flowed freely down Garrison's face, and he made no effort to stop them. I've spent 15 years building an empire to avenge my father, and in the process, I forgot everything that really mattered to him. He looked up at Ren. And when I finally found someone who looks at me like I'm the sun, I almost lost her by not knowing how to distinguish the important from the urgent. Ren felt her own heart beating hard, tears threatening to escape from her eyes. Garrison, I've been an idiot, he continued. I blamed you for my economic losses when you should have been my reason to celebrate. I pushed you away when I needed you most. And the worst part is, I know exactly why I did it. Because accepting your love meant admitting I didn't need success to be valuable, and that terrified me more than any financial bankruptcy. He moved closer to her, still on his knees among his father's memories, and took her hands. I don't know if you can forgive me. I don't know if I should ask you to after everything I've put you through, but I needed you to know that I finally understand. I'm not what I own. I'm not my projects or my numbers or my reputation. I'm the man who loves you, and that should have been enough from the beginning. The words floated between them, laden with pain and hope, with regret and possibility. Ren looked at him, searching in his eyes for signs of the authenticity she so desperately needed to find. And it was there. Beyond the tears, beyond the exhaustion and defeat, something shone that she had glimpsed for the first time at that charity gala, something she had feared lost forever during the dark months of their marriage. The real man, the man who wanted to be. I can't promise it will be easy, she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. There are wounds that need time to heal. I know. And I need the change to be real this time, not just pretty words after a difficult night. I know. But if you're willing to really try, the tears finally escaped, rolling down her cheeks. I'm willing too. They embraced there on the study floor, surrounded by photographs of a past Garrison was finally ready to face, while outside New York continued its relentless rhythm, oblivious to the moment of redemption unfolding in that luxury apartment. The following days were an exercise in patience and will. Garrison and Ren didn't magically return to harmony. The wounds were too deep to heal overnight. But for the first time since they'd returned from the honeymoon, there was a conscious intention to rebuild what had been broken. They began with small gestures. Garrison started having breakfast at home before going to the office, transforming the early morning hours into a sacred space to talk without the distractions of the outside world. Ren, for her part, made a conscious effort to understand the complexity of his business, not to participate in it, but to comprehend the pressures he faced. One April afternoon, while spring sun bathed Manhattan in golds and greens, Garrison arrived at the Williamsburg studio with a folder under his arm. Ren was alone, taking advantage of the quiet hours between classes to work on a series of pieces she'd been developing, vessels inspired by traditional Vermont patterns, but reinterpreted with contemporary sensibility. I want to show you something, he said, opening the folder on one of the work tables. Inside were architectural plans, but different from the ones Ren had seen when he showed her his commercial projects. These were more intimate, more human. What is this? My first real project in 15 years, Garrison responded, and there was a brightness in his eyes she hadn't seen since before the crisis. Affordable housing in the Bronx. Apartments designed for families who could never afford what I normally build. Small but dignified spaces, with natural light, common areas where children can play, community gardens where neighbors can get to know each other. Ren examined the plans carefully, noticing details that revealed a different philosophy. Large windows oriented to maximize sunlight, balconies designed for plants and conversations, storage spaces thought out for the real needs of families with limited budgets. How did you get this? She asked. I thought your company was... The company is changing, he interrupted. I sold 3 of my luxury projects, the ones in initial phases. The money isn't what it was before, but it's enough to keep operations going while we reorient everything. Reorient toward what? Garrison looked at her directly, and in his gaze was a determination she recognized, but transformed. It was no longer the determination of a conqueror, but of a builder. Toward what I should have been doing from the beginning. Architecture that serves people, not just investors. Projects that leave neighborhoods better than they found them, not destroying them in the name of progress. He paused, searching for words. I want my work to have the same meaning as yours. I want to be able to look at what I build and feel the same thing you feel when you see one of your finished ceramics. Wren left the plans on the table and walked to him, her hands still stained with gray clay. Do you know what this means? She asked. Less money, less prestige, less power. And more purpose, he completed. More connection to what I do. More ability to look in the mirror without asking myself, who the hell is the guy looking back? She smiled, a smile that started small but grew until it lit up her entire face. The young architect from Pittsburgh who drew dreams on bar napkins, she said. I finally found you. Took him long enough to show up, he admitted, but I think he's here to stay. The Bronx project became much more than a real estate development. Garrison involved the future residents in the design process, something unheard of in his industry. Listening to their needs, incorporating their suggestions, treating them as collaborators rather than mere recipients of his generosity. And in a gesture that surprised everyone, he included a community space in the design that would be dedicated to artisan workshops. When neighbors asked him what it would be for, he simply responded, so people can create beautiful things with their hands. There's someone very special who taught me that's as important as having a roof over your head. Summer arrived with its endless days and golden light that seemed to permeate every corner of New York. Wren and Garrison had found a new rhythm, one that honored both her needs and his, a balance neither would have imagined possible a year before. But there was a pending conversation that neither had dared to initiate. A conversation about the future, about where they wanted this new version of their relationship to take them, about what it really meant to rebuild a life together. One July night, while they dined on the apartment terrace with Manhattan lights shining beneath them like an ocean of earthly stars, Garrison finally found the courage to open that door. I've been thinking, he began, playing with his wine glass in a way that betrayed his nerves. This apartment has never really been ours. It was mine before I met you, decorated by professionals who never asked what I liked. Every piece of furniture, every painting was chosen to impress visitors, not to make us happy. Wren looked at him over her own glass, waiting. I've seen a house, and he continued, in Charleston in the historic district. It's old, needs a lot of work, but it has a courtyard with a magnolia tree and enough space for a studio, a real one with its own kiln, where you could make larger pieces, experiment with new techniques. Wren's heart was beating hard, but she forced herself to stay calm. And what would happen with your work, with the New York office? Work from there most of the time. Come to New York when necessary, but not live here. He paused, seeking her eyes. I want to build a home with you, Wren. Not a luxury apartment to impress anyone, but a real home, with walls that accumulate our stories, with rooms full of light where we can imagine a future. The unspoken word floated between them, laden with possibilities. A future with children? She asked softly. Garrison nodded, and in his eyes she saw something that had never been there before, the willingness to be vulnerable, to imagine a life not defined solely by his professional achievements. When I was young, I always assumed I'd have kids someday, but then career consumed everything, and each passing year the idea seemed more distant, more unreal. He extended his hand across the table, seeking hers. With you, I can imagine teaching a child to shape clay. I can imagine family dinners where we talk about the day, not financial statements. I can imagine being the father my father never got the chance to be. Wren interlaced her fingers with his, feeling the warmth of his palm, the solidity of his presence. Then let's go see that house, she said, and then we'll talk about the rest. The house in Charleston's historic district was everything Garrison had promised and more. Located on a cobblestone street descending toward the harbor, its centuries-old walls guarded generations of history. The courtyard, as he had described, housed a mature magnolia tree whose branches intertwined over a small fountain that no longer worked but added romantic charm to the space. Wren knew it was her home from the moment she crossed the threshold. "The walls need work," said the real estate agent, trying to manage expectations. "And the electrical system is from the last century. The second-floor roof has some leaks." "We'll take it," Wren interrupted, turning to Garrison with bright eyes. The following months were a whirlwind of renovation that brought them closer than any couple's therapy could have achieved. They worked side by side with local artisans, learning to respect the original architecture while adapting the house to their contemporary needs. Garrison applied his architectural experience in ways he had never imagined, not to maximize sellable square footage, but to create spaces that invited life. The studio was installed in what had been the old carriage house, a structure separated from the main building with thick walls that maintained stable temperature for drying ceramics. Wren personally supervised the kiln installation, choosing a model that combined traditional techniques with modern efficiency. The shelves were built by a carpenter from a nearby town, using wood reclaimed from an old house they were demolishing. The day the studio was finished, Wren stood alone among its walls, breathing the smell of old brick and new possibilities. Her grandmother's wheel occupied the place of honor by the window overlooking the magnolia courtyard. Inherited tools hung orderly on panels she had designed herself, and in a corner, simply framed, was a photograph of her grandmother working in the Brattleboro studio, her young hands shaping a vessel that probably still existed in some American home. "We're here, Grandma," Wren whispered. "The tradition continues." That year's autumn brought with it the first wedding anniversary they really celebrated. There were no galas or jewels or Michelin-starred restaurants. Instead, they invited their families to the Charleston house for a meal that Wren and her mother prepared together in the newly renovated kitchen. The courtyard table accommodated 18 people. Wren's parents, her siblings with their families, some friends from the Williamsburg studio, which Wren had passed to Carmen, who now managed it with the same love, and even Marcus, Garrison's assistant, who had proven to be much more than an employee during difficult times. The only conspicuous absence was Garrison's family. His mother had died when he was 20, and his father had followed 4 years later. There were no siblings, no close uncles, no cousins with whom he maintained contact. For years that hadn't seemed like a significant loss. His world was populated with business partners and professional contacts who fulfilled specific functions without requiring emotional connection. But that afternoon, surrounded by Wren's loud and loving family, he felt the weight of his inherited solitude with new acuity. Thomas, Wren's father, had received him with a bear hug that left him momentarily breathless. Eleanor had kissed him on both cheeks and then dragged him to the kitchen to taste the she-crab soup before anyone else. Wren's nieces and nephews ran through the courtyard, chasing a neighbor's cat that had snuck in, their laughter filling spaces that in the Tribeca apartment had always remained empty. "You look overwhelmed," observed Caleb, Wren's brother, approaching him with 2 glasses of sweet tea. Garrison accepted the glass gratefully. "I'm not used to this," he admitted, gesturing to the organized chaos surrounding them. "Family chaos is an acquired taste," Caleb laughed. "But once you get used to it, you can't live without it." "I'm beginning to understand." Caleb studied him for a moment. With that evaluating look all the Hartleys shared. "Wren is happy here," he said finally, "happier than I've seen her since you got married. Whatever you're doing differently, keep doing it." Before Garrison could respond, Eleanor appeared, announcing that dinner was ready, and the family whirlwind dragged them toward the table set under the magnolia tree. The meal extended for hours, as it always did at Hartley family gatherings. Dishes came and went, conversations overlapped, stories were told and retold with variations depending on who narrated them. Garrison found himself contributing more than he expected, telling anecdotes of his youth in Pittsburgh he had never shared with anyone, discovering that his memories of relative poverty didn't provoke pity but recognition in people who had experienced similar struggles. When the sun began to descend toward the harbor, tinting the sky with oranges and purples that rivaled the tones of Wren's pottery, Garrison stood from the table and asked for silence. "I want to thank you," he began, his voice slightly hoarse with emotion. "Not just for being here today, but for accepting me when you had every reason in the world to distrust me. I've been a difficult man to love, stubborn, arrogant, too self-centered. But your daughter, your sister, your friend—" He looked at Wren, whose face shone with contained tears. "She's taught me there are different ways to measure success, and none of them appear on a financial statement." Eleanor brought her hand to her heart, moved. Thomas nodded with the silent approval that was his maximum expression of affection. "A year ago," Garrison continued, "in a luxury suite at Martha's Vineyard, I asked my wife to take everything off, expecting one thing and receiving something very different. She removed the jewels I had imposed on her, the masks the world expected her to wear, and showed me who she really was. That night, unknowingly, she began removing my own masks too. It's been a painful, slow process, full of steps backward and stumbles. But today, here, surrounded by people who truly love, I think I can finally say I'm starting to be the man she deserves." He turned to Wren and extended his hand. "Will you dance with me?" There was no music, but it didn't matter. As they moved slowly under the magnolia tree, with the family's murmur as soundtrack and the first stars appearing over Charleston, Wren knew she had found something all the jewels in the world could never have bought. A home, a family, a love that had survived the storm. Winter arrived in Charleston with mists that wrapped the harbor and frosts that turned the magnolia courtyard into a crystal garden. Wren protected the tree with thick blankets, pampering it like a pet, and spent long hours in the studio, letting the kiln's heat warm her hands while she worked on her new collection. The Charleston studio had developed its own identity, different from Williamsburg's but complementary. Here there were no regular group classes. Instead, Wren accepted apprentices for short seasons, artists and artisans who wanted to deepen specific techniques or simply needed a creation space without city distractions. Visitors came from all over America, some even from abroad, attracted by a reputation that had grown by word of mouth. One February day, while rain fell on the city's colonial roofs, Wren received an unexpected visit. A middle-aged woman with white hair pulled in an austere bun and hands betraying decades of manual labor appeared at the studio door. "Are you the granddaughter of Margaret Hartley?" she asked without preamble. Wren felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "Yes, she was my grandmother." "Did you know her?" The woman smiled, and in that smile were decades of memories. "I learned from her over 40 years ago in Brattleboro. There were 3 of us apprentices that summer. Me, a girl from Maine who died years ago, and a boy from New Hampshire who now has a famous studio in Portland. Your grandmother taught us everything we know." Wren invited the woman in, making her hot coffee while listening to stories of her grandmother she had never heard. Stories of a young Margaret who even then had the infinite patience that would characterize her entire life, who could detect a flaw in clay just by touching it, who fervently believed in transmitting knowledge to whoever was willing to receive it. "I found out what you do here," said the woman, whose name was Dorothy. "How you teach, how you preserve old techniques while letting them evolve. Your grandmother would be proud." The words fell on Wren like a long-awaited blessing. "There's one more thing," Dorothy continued, searching for something in her bag. "Before she died, Margaret mailed this to me. She said someday I'd understand what it was for." She handed her a small package wrapped in old newspaper. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, yellowed pages filled with familiar handwriting that made Wren's eyes fill with tears. "These are her notes," Dorothy explained. "Glaze recipes, techniques she invented, designs she never got to make. She told me the right person would know what to do with them." That night, Wren stayed awake until dawn, reading her grandmother's words like one reads a treasure map. The recipes were treasures in themselves, glaze formulas that produced colors she hadn't seen reproduced anywhere else, firing techniques that allowed unique effects, designs inspired by Vermont mountain nature. But even more valuable were the personal reflections interspersed between technical instructions. "Clay is patient," Margaret had written in an undated entry. It waits for us to be ready to shape it. It demands nothing but offers everything, like true love. Today I taught my granddaughter to center the piece on the wheel. She's 6 years old and her hands are small, but she already understands that the secret isn't in strength but in constancy. Someday she'll understand the same lesson applies to life. Mistakes aren't failures. They're questions Clay asks us. Are you paying attention? Are you present? Or is your mind elsewhere while your hands work without purpose? When Garrison came down looking for her at dawn, worried about her absence, he found her crying over the open notebook. "My grandmother left me this," she said, showing him the pages. "It's like she's speaking to me from beyond time." Garrison sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her, and together they read some of the entries. On one of the last pages they found something that left them speechless. "If someday my granddaughters have children of their own, I hope they teach them what I taught them. Not the techniques which can be learned from any book, but the essence. That creating with your hands is a form of meditation, that beauty can emerge from the humblest clay, and that the true value of any object is in the love with which it was made." Wren closed the notebook and pressed it against her chest. "I want to have a child," she said, the words coming out with a certainty that surprised her. "I want to teach them everything my grandmother taught me. I want them to know where they come from, to understand there are traditions worth preserving." Garrison looked at her, and in his eyes there was no doubt or hesitation. "Then let's do it," he answered. "Let's build that future together." Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, and with it confirmation that life had listened to their wishes. Wren knew she was pregnant one April morning, when golden light entered through the bedroom window and the scent of blooming magnolia perfumed the air. She told Garrison that same night after dinner, while they walked through the historic district's cobblestone streets under a sky full of stars. "We're going to have a baby," she announced, stopping their walk in front of the small French Huguenot church that was now a museum. Garrison took a moment to process the words. Then, with an expression combining terror, joy, and wonder, he lifted her in his arms and began spinning with her under the stars, laughing like he hadn't since childhood. "We're going to be parents," he repeated, as if he needed to hear it in his own voice to believe it. "I'm going to be a father." The pregnancy passed with the smoothness of a river that knows its path. Wren continued working in the studio until well into the pregnancy, adapting her movements to her changing body, discovering that the wheel's rhythm had a calming effect on the baby growing inside her. Garrison, for his part, poured renewed energy into the Bronx project, determined to create something his son or daughter could be proud of. Families united in new ways. Eleanor traveled regularly from Brattleboro to make sure her daughter ate properly, filling the freezer with homemade meals and the studio with town gossip. Thomas arrived with wooden toys he carved himself during long winter nights. Wren's siblings called constantly, competing for the honor of being the baby's godparents. And at some point during that summer of waiting, while Charleston's heat warmed the city's old stones, Garrison understood something that had taken him 45 years to learn. True wealth isn't counted in dollars or built square footage, but in shared moments, in forged bonds, in the privilege of having people who care about your well-being, simply because they love you. The baby arrived one October night, when the full moon illuminated Charleston with silver light that made the old stones glow as if guarding luminous secrets. Wren felt the first contractions while having dinner with Garrison in the courtyard, under the magnolia tree now laden with ripe fruit. At first she thought it was a false alarm, but when the pain intensified and the rhythm became regular, she knew the moment had arrived. The nearest hospital was in the city. 20 minutes by car through winding roads Garrison traversed with a combination of speed and caution that left him bathed in cold sweat. Wren, beside him, alternated between deep breaths and ironic comments about his driving that showed even in pain, she hadn't lost her sense of humor. "If you crash now, the baby will be born in a ditch, and I'll have to tell them that story their whole life," she said between contractions. "Then be quiet and let me concentrate," he responded, but there was a tense smile on his lips. Labor was long, 12 hours of work that tested both their endurance. Garrison remained beside her the entire time, holding her hand, wiping sweat from her forehead, murmuring words of encouragement she probably didn't hear. but he needed to say anyway. And then, when dawn began tinting the sky pink and orange, the moment arrived. With one last effort that seemed to exhaust all of Wren's energy reserves, a newborn's cry filled the room. "It's a girl," the midwife announced, placing the tiny being on her mother's chest. Wren looked at the creature she had just brought into the world, tiny, perfect, with a tuft of dark hair and eyes that blinked before the light of the new day. Tears rolled down her cheeks without her trying to stop them. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you for a long time." Garrison leaned over them, surrounding his wife and daughter with arms trembling with emotion. When the baby opened her eyes and seemed to look directly at him, something broke inside him, something old and hard he had kept since his father's death. In its place bloomed something new, a love so fierce and absolute it left him speechless. "Margaret," Wren said, looking up at him. "I want to name her Margaret, after my grandmother." "Margaret," Garrison repeated, and the name felt like a promise. The following weeks were a whirlwind of sleepless nights, diapers, inexplicable cries, and moments of tenderness that made up for everything else. The Charleston house, which had already felt like a home, now pulsed with new life. The magnolia tree in the courtyard seemed to lean toward the baby's room windows, like curious grandparents wanting to peek. The studio was temporarily abandoned while Wren adapted to her new role. But even in the midst of motherhood's exhaustion, her hands longed for clay. One afternoon, while Margaret slept in her rocking cradle and Garrison worked in his study, Wren went down to the studio for the first time in weeks. The familiar smell enveloped her like an embrace. Her grandmother's wheel waited by the window, covered with a tarp she herself had placed before giving birth. She uncovered it slowly, caressing the worn wood, and suddenly knew exactly what she wanted to create. She worked during the baby's nap hours, stealing moments from the chaos of new motherhood. The piece took shape gradually, a large bowl with thick walls and gently undulating rim, designed to hold fruit or perhaps memories. On its interior, using her grandmother's glazes she had replicated thanks to the inherited notebook, she painted a magnolia tree with branches extending toward the sky and roots sinking deep into the earth. When the piece was finished, she placed it in the center of the courtyard table, under the real magnolia tree that seemed to recognize itself in its clay image. "It's beautiful," Garrison said when he saw it. "What does it represent?" "Us," Wren answered. "The roots are where we come from, my family, your struggles, the traditions that formed us. The trunk is what we've built together, solid and resilient. The branches are where we're going. Margaret, the future, all the possibilities we don't yet know." He surrounded her with his arms, both contemplating the piece that synthesized their story. "2 years ago," he said, "in a suite at Martha's Vineyard, I asked you to take everything off, expecting one thing and receiving something completely different. I thought I was in control, that I knew what I wanted, that I had life planned down to the last detail." He paused, kissing her hair. "Thank you for showing me I was wrong. Thank you for being willing to change," she responded. "Many men would have chosen someone easier to mold. I didn't want to mold anyone. I wanted to be molded. I just didn't know it until you showed me." Margaret's cry interrupted the moment, calling them back to parenthood's immediate demands. But as they climbed the stairs toward the baby's room, Garrison felt a peace he hadn't experienced in his entire adult life. He had a home that was truly his. He had a love that had survived every test. He had a daughter who would give him the chance to be the father he'd always wanted to have. And for the first time, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The Charleston house's courtyard buzzed with activity. Margaret, now a 2-year-old with her father's dark hair and her mother's honey-colored eyes, ran between adults' legs chasing soap bubbles that her grandfather Thomas blew for her with the infinite patience of smitten grandparents. It was the celebration of their 4th wedding anniversary, though no one called it that anymore. It had simply become the Magnolia Gathering, an annual tradition that attracted family and friends from across America. The courtyard tables overflowed with food, prepared by multiple hands, and the air vibrated with conversations in various tones and simultaneous volumes. Wren watched the scene from the studio doorway, a cup of tea cooling forgotten in her hands. Her grandmother's notebook rested on her work table, open to a page she had reread hundreds of times. Life, like clay, doesn't always take the shape we plan, but if we work it with love and patience, even the most unexpected deviations can become beauty. Garrison approached her, Margaret in his arms, the little girl pointing enthusiastically at a bird that had landed on the magnolia's highest branch. "Look, Mommy, bird!" the child shouted with the excitement only children can invest in everyday miracles. "I see it, sweetheart," Wren responded, extending her arms to receive her daughter. Garrison stayed beside them, his hand resting on his wife's back, watching the gathering unfolding in their courtyard. He had changed in ways even he sometimes didn't recognize. The lines around his eyes were deeper, not from worry but from frequent smiles. His posture was more relaxed. His shoulders no longer carried the weight of an empire constantly threatening to collapse. The Bronx project had been completed the previous year, and the families now living there had celebrated with a community party. He had attended not as a benefactor magnate but as another neighbor. He had danced with grandmothers who thanked him with tears in their eyes, had played soccer with kids who had no idea how much money he'd had to turn down to make that project possible. He had felt, for the first time in his career, that his work had a purpose beyond numbers. His company was smaller now, much smaller than it had been at its peak, but each project he accepted was chosen carefully, ensuring it contributed something positive to the communities where he built. The waiting list of clients wanting to work with him under these new conditions grew constantly. It turned out there was a market, perhaps larger than anyone had imagined, for architecture with soul. "What are you thinking about?" Wren asked, noticing the contemplative expression on his face. "About the man I was 4 years ago," he answered. "About how close I came to losing all this by not knowing how to value it." "But you didn't lose it." "No. Thanks to a woman who had the courage to remove her jewels when I asked her to take off everything else." Wren smiled, remembering that night at Martha's Vineyard that now seemed to belong to another life. "Do you regret anything?" she asked. Garrison considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret the time I wasted trying to be who I wasn't. I regret the nights I spent at the office when I could have been getting to know you better. I regret making you feel less than perfect even for a single moment." He paused. "But I don't regret anything that brought us here, not even the mistakes, because the mistakes finally woke me up." Margaret, bored with adult conversation, squirmed to get down from her mother's arms and ran toward where her grandmother Eleanor waited with a piece of homemade cake. The adults watched her depart, her tiny figure navigating between adults' legs with the confidence of someone who knows they're unconditionally loved. "Do you think she'll understand someday?" Garrison asked. "What it cost to get here?" "I hope she never has to understand it the same way," Wren responded. "I hope for her, authentic love is normal, not something she had to fight to find. But we'll teach her anyway. Of course, we'll teach her everything we learned so she can start where we arrived instead of where we began." The sun began descending toward the harbor, tinting the Charleston sky with the same golden and purple colors they had witnessed so many times from this same courtyard. The magnolia tree cast long shadows over the feast tables, and the first stars began appearing timidly in the east. Eleanor began singing a traditional Vermont song, a melody speaking of lost and found loves, of lands left behind, and homes built with hope. Other voices gradually joined, some off-key, others surprisingly beautiful, all contributing to a harmony both imperfect and perfect. Garrison took Wren's hand, interlacing their fingers, as he had learned to do on that first walk on Martha's Vineyard beach, when the world was new and everything seemed possible. "Will you dance with me?" he asked, repeating the words from their first real anniversary. "Always," she answered, and as they moved slowly under the magnolia tree, surrounded by family and friends, with the echo of an old song floating in the air, perfumed with magnolia blossoms, they both knew they had found something more valuable than any fortune money could buy. They had found authenticity, vulnerability, the courage to be who they really were. They had found, in words Wren whispered while they danced, the home they had always been seeking without knowing it, and it had all begun with a simple act of silent rebellion, with a woman who chose to interpret her husband's words in a way he never anticipated, removing not her clothes, but all the masks the world expected her to wear.